Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So the IndieGoGo campaign for the AYANEO Next is supposed to come out any day now, and I've been testing and using this device for a little over a month now, and so I thought it'd be a good time to do a 1 month later video. And so in this video, I'm going to just show you really quickly how I've been using it over this past month and just some of the things I've learned along the way. And of course, if you haven't seen that video before, I'll leave a link to it in the video description. So first and foremost, I want to talk a little bit about the user interface and what I've been doing in order to get the best experience possible on this device. And you may notice here, I'm using a front end to basically navigate through all of my games. And this here is BigBox. This is basically a front end that's made by Launchbox, but specifically made for devices using controllers as opposed to a mouse and keyboard input. And so the way I have it set up is I basically went into Launchbox and created all my folder structure and imported all my games and then connected everything to my emulators individually and all that other work on the back end. It probably took me maybe 3 or 4 hours altogether. But now I have a nice unified way of getting through all my systems. And this isn't the only front end that's available. For example, I plan on trying out one called Play Night here soon. But since I already had the BigBox license, I thought this would be a better fit. And so, for the most part, once I had everything set up, this is the main front end that I use day in and day out. I'll definitely jump over to the Windows side when I need to configure settings or things like that, but for the most part, BigBox has been working just great. And I would say about half the time I spend playing on this device, I'm using it for emulation. In particular, I've been using it for Wii U and Switch emulation, and then a little bit of PS2 as well. As you can see, I'm about an hour or two into Wind Waker here. This is the HD version from the Wii U, and it's been a relatively seamless experience. Part of what makes it seamless is the AYA Quick tool, which I showed off in my review here. And it'll allow you to change things like your TDP, brightness settings, as well as your fan speed. And once you have all those factors dialed in perfectly for the game you're playing, it can really help with battery life. And so over time, I've just kind of learned what settings work best for each game. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about controls. This is something that I wish I'd spent just a tiny bit more time on in my review. Overall, I'm a fan of this D-pad. I like the fact that it has a little bit of grittiness to it, and each of the cardinal points flare out a little bit, which makes them easy to identify with your hand. And when it comes to travel, I think the overall distance here is pretty good. Especially when you're focusing on just up, down, and left, right, it feels very solid. Now, one of the things other people have noted is that this D-pad doesn't have a forced pivot point. What I mean by that is there's not a piece of plastic in the center of the D-pad that prevents you from pushing the whole thing down at once. And while many people may use that as a measurement of whether or not a D-pad is good or not, I've found that the lack of pivot point here doesn't actually prevent me from using the D-pad as I want. The diagonals are just fine to me, and like I said before, the cardinal points are good too. So overall, I do think it is a good D-pad, and I think if they did maybe add a pivot point to it, it might be a little bit better as well. Now, in terms of the analog sticks, I have zero complaints here. These are using a Hall magnetic sensor here, so you have no worries about stick drift, and they just feel really nice and chunky. And there's been a recent firmware update that fixes any sort of calibration issues. I never had any with mine, but I've heard other people complaining about that. The analog triggers are also really excellent on here. They're also magnetic sensors. And initially they do feel a little bit oversized, but I've become accustomed to the size and I really appreciate the amount of travel here. It feels like you have a wide range of control options. The shoulder buttons are just fine too, no complaints here. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the face buttons too. Overall, I enjoy these as well. If I had to make any complaints about the face buttons, it would be the fact that they feel a little bit smaller than I would like, and I wish the buttons were a little bit more rounded. Maybe something like the PS4 gamepad or even the Xbox controller. I think that with rounded buttons that were a little bit bigger, this would be a better gameplay experience. I'm more than happy with the amount of travel here. I do think they work out pretty well, but the fact that they're so small and a device so big makes them feel just a little bit dainty. But taken as a whole, I would say the controls on this device are some of the best I've ever felt before. Now, I've heard great things about the Steam Deck, and I'm really looking forward to testing that in the future. But as it stands right now, the combination of the super hefty analog sticks and then those wonderful analog triggers, they kind of make up for those minor complaints I have about the D-pad and face buttons. Overall, it's a great control experience. Now, like I showed earlier in the video, getting into games from BigBox is super easy and a seamless experience. Now, unfortunately, closing out of a game is not the same. It depends on the emulator. I found the easiest thing to do is to press the desktop button on the far right, and then actually just use my finger to tap on the emulator and then select Close Window. It's not a very elegant way to close out of your games, but luckily it does bring you back to the BigBox menu. And it's going to depend on the emulator. For example, if you use RetroArch for your retro systems, you can then assign a hotkey that'll close out of RetroArch. And then others like the PSP emulator or Windows games, you can actually just go into the menu and quit out of the emulator there. Now let's talk a little bit about Windows games too, because I've spent about half of my time when playing Windows PC games as well. And like with the emulators, I've imported all of my PC games. This is coming from my Steam, GOG, and Epic Game Store libraries. And while I assumed that I was going to be mostly playing AAA games, like pushing this device to its limits, I found that I've actually enjoyed using kind of mid-range games instead. For example, Ori and the Will of the Wisps has been like my #1 game to play on this device. The games on here I think look incredibly gorgeous on this 7-inch display, and the really precise controls of the analog sticks and triggers does seem to make a difference when I'm playing a game that requires precise input like this one. Now another thing that I've been messing around with is just some of the internal settings that are available in AYANEO devices. Because this one here is the third AYANEO device that's been released, we're starting to see a fairly large community built around these handheld PCs. And so what I'm going to do is I'll leave a link to this Reddit post down below, and it has some really nice things in here, how to update your drivers, and then various launcher options and controller improvements, things like that. For example, I was able to follow this and then unlock gyroscopic controls on the PC, and that works really well with things like Nintendo Switch or Wii U games. One of the other tools that I found in this resource is this one here. It's called the AMD APU Tuning Utility. And this basically will allow you to do more finite changes to your TDP instead of using the IA Quick tool. And they have a bunch of pre-made presets that include the chipset that's on here, the 5800U. And so I've set up a default setting of a 25-watt TDP. The IA Quick tool just goes to a maximum of 20. So when I turn this one on, I can get a little bit higher of a TDP. Obviously this is going to affect battery life, but when it comes to certain games, for example emulating Breath of the Wild, that 25-watt TDP will make a big difference when it comes to keeping your frame rate above 30 frames per second, especially in some of those larger areas like this village here. If I switch it back to the 20-watt TDP, you're going to see it's constantly dipping below 30 frames per second. And that will result in a little bit of audio stuttering and some slowdown in the game itself. Anything over 30 you'll feel just fine, but anything below you will start to feel it. And so when it comes to certain areas, it may be in your best interest to up the TDP to 25 watts, and that tuning utility is going to be really handy in that regard. So let me show you the rest of my desktop setup. So I have BigBox here, which we already talked about, and I also have RetroBat still set up, and I showed this in my review video. This is basically an emulation station front end for Windows devices. And I would say it works pretty well for these devices, although I did find that the launch box setup was a little bit more intuitive and easier. Another complaint I have about RetroBat on these devices in particular is that it doesn't seem to scale up correctly to the screen resolution. If anything, I would say it feels like I'm looking at a 480p on a 720p display. The text is all just a little bit fuzzy. And I tried all sorts of setting changes and I couldn't find a way to get it to upscale correctly. Surprisingly, when I plug this device into my monitor and use it as an extended display, it scales correctly then. It just doesn't have optimal scaling for this screen in particular. And finally, I've also played around a little bit with the Steam Big Picture mode. And this is also a controller-friendly front end, but it's not quite as robust as something like Launchbox. For example, you can import your individual emulators, but you wouldn't be able to, say for example, create a full-on menu like you can in Launchbox. And GOG Galaxy also has a front end that works a lot like this one too, but I would say that BigBox is going to be a little bit easier to use. And so yeah, in general, when it comes to Steam, GOG Galaxy, and the Epic Game Launcher, I've mostly just been using them within Launchbox instead. I've done a little bit of streaming via the Xbox app as well as Chiaki for my PS4 and PS5, but I honestly haven't been using it as much as I thought I would. And of course, I still have my individual emulators here on the desktop, but honestly, I use those in Launchbox as well. Now, one game I do want to show off real quick that I've been enjoying a lot is this one here, Super Mario 64 Plus. And this is basically a front-end launcher for the Mario 64 PC port. And it works really well. You can adjust your scaling options to fit the screen dimensions perfectly, and you can also load up whatever mods and things like that you want. Personally, I'm keeping it at a vanilla version of Mario 64, but as you can see, it's running at 60 frames per second and looks beautiful. And when you combine this with the Hall sensor analog sticks here on the device, it's just a wonderful experience. I mean, look, I already have 3 stars in the game, which is well beyond anything I usually ever get in this game when I'm doing my testing. So that's a testament to how fun this is. And finally, when talking about front-end launchers, there is the IA Space option as well. And this is basically the AYANEO's built-in game launcher here. And it has this home display here for your most used games, but you can also go into just the overall game section and pick out every game that you've installed. And you can manually add your games, and you can also search and add your own box art. I just haven't done it for a couple games, as you can see right here. But this tends to work pretty well, but obviously this isn't going to work for emulation. This is just going to be for your PC games. And so I do think overall the big box option seems to be the best for this device so far. I am going to test out the Play Night front-end launcher on the AYANEO 2021 that I recently got, and so when I do my review video for that one, I will show it off then. And so yeah, that's about it when it comes to front ends and software and stuff. A couple other hardware notes here. For example, the fingerprint smudges on the back of this device still bother me after a month. I really hope the final builds of the AYANEO Next do not use the same type of plastic here. It really cheapens this premium experience. Now I found the device gets pretty hot, especially at the top of the device here, but when you're actually holding it in your hands, you're not really going to notice the heat at all. They do a really good job of keeping the heat away from the controller grips to the point where you don't really feel that there's any sort of heat coming off the device at all. Okay, a couple other quick notes here. I really encourage you to get a Bluetooth or USB wireless keyboard as well as a mouse to use when you're doing your setup on the device itself. Because doing things like installing and configuring emulators is going to be just so much easier if you're using a mouse compared to trying to do it with the touchscreen. And so yeah, I would say this is a must-have accessory for setting up the AYANEO Next. And finally, let's talk about the AYN Odin as well, because I've been spending a lot of time with this device to the point where it's taking up time with my AYANEO too. Now this device is like a full $1,000 cheaper than the AYANEO Next. This is the $300 model here, which is the most expensive model, but you can go as cheap as $200 for the light model. And I've done plenty of videos about this one in the past month or so, but I will say that I've kind of configured my gaming experience on the Odin to somewhat match the AYANEO Next. For example, I've been using the Launchbox front end here on the AYN Odin as well. And this is a pretty seamless experience to be able to jump in and out of my retro games. Now obviously this Android-based device is nowhere near as powerful as the AYANEO. It can basically play up to GameCube and a little bit of PS2 and Wii as well. But I think part of the reason why I've really enjoyed this for the lower end systems is just how small it is and how great the battery life is as well. As you can see here with the size comparison, there's quite a big difference. And here's the surprise, Chicken's been on my lap this entire time. You had no idea. But as you can see, the width of the AYANEO Next is about 1.5 inches longer than the AYN Odin. And the variation in size here makes all the difference in the world. I find that if I ever need to go and run some errands, or maybe I'm just going to run to the toilet real quick, I always grab the Odin first. And I think part of that is just that by comparison, it's very lightweight and just easy to pick up and grab. And while the Odin can only play about half the games that the AYANEO can play, it can still play plenty of games that are excellent to play while on the go. Meanwhile, I've been treating the AYANEO Next as basically my premium gaming experience when I have an hour or two to kill. Part of that has to do with the heft of the AYANEO itself. I do like how heavy and solid it feels. On top of that, I think that the grips on each side allow the device to kind of mold into your hands as you rest the device inside. The overall combination of the weight of the device, as well as these nice ergonomics and analog joysticks, it all comes together to make a very nice playing experience. But I think that there are some limitations there. For example, I really only tend to play this while I'm sitting on the couch, or if I want to say, for example, sit at a table or at my desk and play in handheld mode. But alternatively, I cannot play this thing in bed at all. It's way too heavy and noisy. And the extra weight also prevents me from wanting to take it in the car or something like that while on a trip. And so while I do think the AYANEO Next does have a place when it comes to handheld gaming, the overall size does prevent it from being an all-in-one machine. Of course, the other big elephant in the room is the cost of the AYANEO Next, and I talked about this extensively in my review video, and my thoughts on this have not changed. I think that spending something like $1,200+ on a handheld device is kind of overkill, especially when the Steam Deck is just around the corner. If I had $1,500 to spend and I wanted to get a handheld and I had to choose between the Steam Deck and the AYANEO Next, hands down every time, I'm going to go with the Steam Deck, and then I'm going to use that other $1,000 for other things. Even though I don't have the Steam Deck in hand, I have a hard time saying that this device is $1,000 better than the Steam Deck. As we've seen in the early Steam Deck videos, I'm not sure the performance is going to be all that different. And so, like I said in my review video, the two major reasons to get an AYANEO Next is number one, if the Steam Deck is not available in your region, but the AYANEO Next is. And then number two, if you're in the market for a new Windows PC, and the idea of using it in handheld mode is also compelling to you, by virtue of the fact that this is a well-spec'd PC in its own right, you could effectively make this double as a gaming handheld as well as just a regular old PC. I think the Steam Deck might be capable of a similar setup down the line, but I don't think it's going to be as easy to use it as a hybrid console like the AYANEO Next will be right out of the box. Anyway, that's about it for this video. I just wanted to give a quick update on some of the things I've learned about the AYANEO Next in the past month, and some of my thoughts in the month since making that review. And so let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm interested in reading what you think about the AYANEO Next, besides, the half of the comments that are just going to say this thing is too expensive. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.